History as it happens, November 8th, 2024. NAFTA's long shadow.
There will be a giant sucking sound going south.
The U.S. will export more jobs to Mexico.
We have made a decision now that will permit us to create an economic order in the world that will promote more growth, more equality, better preservation of the environment, and a greater possibility of world peace.
This company has been making the most of a huge opportunity that exists right now to bring jobs and manufacturing back to the United States of America.
Thousands of factories were shuttered, millions of manufacturing jobs were destroyed, and entire communities were devastated from Ohio to Pennsylvania, Michigan to Maine, and California to North Carolina, devastated.
When Congress ratified the North American Free Trade Agreement 31 years ago, its supporters promised it would create thousands of jobs and lead the United States into a new era of leadership, one without trade barriers, when market economics and democracy were set to be on the march. A generation later, Donald Trump rode anti-NAFTA politics to the White House. And our country may now be entering a new era of economic nationalism as a backlash to the free trade regime of the post-Cold War triumphalism. How did NAFTA break our politics? That is next as we report history as it happens. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Master Lock employees, not the only ones blindsided by the company's decision to shut down its Milwaukee plant.
Hopefully we can get some of the higher ups to see that how many people will be losing their jobs, how many families this is going to affect.
And I think a lot of that social fabric is through, the unions and the labor movement. I mean, for example, Master Lock, twice a year they have a neighborhood cleanup. This is a very impoverished neighborhood in Milwaukee. It used to have maybe as many as 30,000 jobs in a 4x20 block area called the 30th Street Corridor. Now Master Lock's the last thing standing. It's a heavily African-American neighborhood, probably 95%. It's gone down a lot because of deindustrialization.
And good evening. We begin with breaking news. After nearly a century in Milwaukee, Master Lock is reportedly set to shut down its manufacturing.
May 2023. Master Lock says it is quitting Milwaukee.
Workers will be out of a job. Mary McCarr in the newsroom.
As disheartening as it was unsurprising, as was the only large manufacturing firm left on the north side of the city's industrial sector, and it had already offshored about 1,000 jobs to Mexico and China in the 1990s. Sure, President Obama visited the plant in 2012 to tout an initiative that led Master Lock to bring back about 100 of those jobs, but that only delayed the inevitable in our age of globalization.
And now the hard truth is, a lot of those jobs are not going to come back. In a global economy, some companies are always going to find it more profitable to pick up and do business in some other part of the world. That's just a fact.
Well, was Master Lock's demise inevitable, or was it the consequence of human decisions and some powerful ideas that pervaded the minds of capitalists and policymakers in those heady days after the end of the Cold War? Listen to President Clinton dream as he signed NAFTA into law in 1993.
I spoke with one of the folks who was in the reception just a few moments ago, who told me that he was in China watching the vote on international television when it was taken. And he said, you would have had to be there to understand how important this was to the rest of the world. Not because of the terms of NAFTA, which basically is a trade agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, but because it became a symbolic struggle for the spirit of our country and for how we would approach this very difficult and rapidly changing world, dealing with our own considerable challenges here at home. I believe we have made a decision now that will permit us to create an economic order in the world that will promote more growth, more equality, better preservation of the environment, and a greater possibility of world peace.
NAFTA was politically toxic even then, if you listen to the congressional debates in 1993.
This NAFTA will mean lost jobs in Florida and across our nation.
I support the agreement because I believe it will be of tremendous benefit not only to my district of New Orleans and my state of Louisiana,
but also to the nation as a whole.
Because I think it's very important that the American public know that NAFTA relinquishes much of our national sovereignty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Outside this chamber, the anti-NAFTA forces are hearing this debate, and they are in an absolute panic. And as the hours go by, they are becoming more and more creative. Earlier today, they told us that NAFTA causes cancer, and that was disproved.
And you'll remember Ross Perot's warnings about NAFTA during the 1992 presidential campaign. But today, as a second Trump term is about to begin, not only NAFTA, but multilateral free trade agreements in general, among other things, are fueling a powerful populist backlash in the United States. Because, as our guest in this episode wrote for the New York Times Magazine, NAFTA hurt the middle class and broke our politics. Milwaukee was once known as the machine shop of the world, writes the journalist Dan Kaufman. In the 1950s, nearly 60% of the city's adult population worked in manufacturing, a vast majority of whom held well-paying union jobs. In 1969, Milwaukee had the second highest median income in the country. By 2021, he writes, Milwaukee had lost more than 80% of its manufacturing jobs. Barely 5% of those that remained were unionized. And it had the second highest poverty rate of any large American city. Just one example of NAFTA's profound impact on American industry and labor. He goes on to say, deindustrialization has diminished the wealth, power, and health of working-class Americans, arguably more than any other single culprit. While deindustrialization has many causes, in a recessionary 4-year period that ended in the early 1980s, a quarter of Milwaukee's manufacturing jobs are wiped out. A central driver has been free trade agreements with developing countries, of which NAFTA was the first. Dan Kaufman, a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine. This article was published in September. I'll share a link to it in my weekly newsletter. You can sign up free by searching for History as It Happens on Substack. Dan Kaufman, the author of The Fall of Wisconsin, the conservative conquest of a progressive bastion and the future of American politics. Hello and welcome to the show.
Hi, Martin. Thanks for having me.
I think the timing worked out well. We had to put this off a couple of times, but now we're talking after the election. We know who won, and Donald Trump, a big part of his platform, is opposition to free trade deals. You know, NAFTA was not a big deal in this campaign. It had been, amended during Trump's first term. But when it was negotiated, debated, ratified more than 30 years ago, it was very controversial, especially among Democrats, among organized labor, Democratic constituencies. It didn't take long either for the negative consequences to be felt. But why do you think it took a generation or more, the 2016 campaign, for a major party presidential candidate to make a big issue out of NAFTA?
It's a great question. I think for a long time, the elites in both parties were supportive of free trade deals broadly, so there wasn't that much distinction. However, I would push back a little bit on two things. One, it was also a big deal in this election. J.D. Vance and Trump mentioned it in their acceptance speeches at the RNC. Barack Obama campaigned against it. He criticized Hillary Clinton in 2008 for supporting it.
I forgot about that, but thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was a big, he called it devastating, and it was percolating upwards.
I think that it is inaccurate for Senator Clinton to say that she's always opposed NAFTA. In her campaign for Senate, she said that NAFTA, on balance, had been good for New York and good for America. I disagree with that. I think that it did not have the labor standards and environmental standards that were required in order to not just be good for Wall Street, but also be good for Main Street. And if you travel through Youngstown and you travel through communities in my home state of Illinois, you will see entire cities that have been devastated as a consequence of trade agreements that were not adequately structured to make sure that U.S. workers had a fair deal.
Its presence was already felt earlier. There's a study that I cite in my article which analyzed counties, political shifts in counties that had industries heavily exposed to NAFTA. And they found that there was a significant shift to the right among those counties versus ones that did not have industries that were exposed to job losses through NAFTA. And then in 2016, you had opposition to it from both sides, also on the left. Bernie Sanders criticized Hillary Clinton extensively. In fact, revived his campaign in Michigan by his fierce opposition to NAFTA. And he had been in Congress when NAFTA was originally debated and spoke out fiercely against it.
This treaty, in an amazing way, is being supported by almost every newspaper in America. We have a nation which is divided, but somehow or another, the corporate media, almost without exception, I have yet to see the daily newspaper that is opposition to NAFTA. So you have all of corporate America telling the American people that this agreement is a good agreement for them. To my mind, Madam Speaker, the $64 question is really quite simple. What is the track record of corporate America?
I recently played a clip of Sanders on a recent episode thrashing Clinton over her support of free trade deals, including NAFTA.
Exactly.
You mentioned Obama, but then he negotiated the TPP, talking about the larger issue of free trade. Global free trade regime led by the United States post-1945. You said how elites, more or less in both parties, had always supported this.
It's true. And Obama's opposition to NAFTA was really rhetorical. I mean, he didn't do anything. And as you say, he pushed until the very end, even after Trump was elected. In the lame duck period, he was pushing for the TPP, which was just to remind listeners, it was called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And it involved 12 countries. Eventually, it was signed by 11 countries. Those 12 countries accounted for 40% of the global economy, most of the countries in Asia. Yeah, it was the bipartisan policy rooted in neoliberal economics. It goes back to really Milton Friedman and that movement. And it was first suggested by Ronald Reagan in the 1980 presidential campaign. He first floated it in 1979. Then it was negotiated by George H.W. Bush, but it needed to be ratified by Congress. And as you mentioned, it became a central issue in the 1992 presidential campaign. And there were really three positions around it. You had Bill Clinton, who kind of staked out a middle ground, saying he would support it with side agreements protecting labor and environmental regulations. And George H.W. Bush, who supported it unequivocally. And Ross Perot, whose campaign was sort of centered around opposition to it.
H.W. Bush wanted fast-track approval in Congress. He did not want any strings attached. Labor protections, environmental standards. He just wanted a straight free trade deal, cut down trade barriers. We'll return to that in a little bit. You did mention Perot, who was ardently against it. The famous quote at the debate, the giant sucking sound.
You can move your factory south of the border, pay $1 an hour for labor, hire a young 25, that's assuming you've been in business for a long time, you've got a mature workforce. Pay $1 an hour for your labor, have no health care, that's the most expensive single element in making a car, have no environmental controls, no pollution controls, and no retirement, and you don't care about anything but making money, there will be a giant sucking sound going south.
The larger context here also includes the experience of the Great Depression and World War II, victory in World War II, and the new free trade regime, globalization that the U.S. led as well. Because the United States had always been a moderate or high tariff economy for most of its history before then. We don't have to go all the way back to 1789 over here, Dan, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm glad you mentioned the period after the New Deal. There was a different possibility propagated at that time that I mentioned briefly in my article, which was there was an agreement that was being negotiated for International Trade Organization. But that was very different than what came out. That would have had protections, enforceable labor standards. It also had very strong antitrust provisions in it. It was more the Rooseveltian vision of free trade with significant restraints on capital. That wasn't what was passed. It was opposed by a very powerful Ohio Republican Senator, Robert Taft, and that was basically crushed. What came out was GATT, the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, which had none of those other things in it. And that then became the model. GATT was the precursor to the World Trade Organization and was essential for China's admittance to the World Trade Organization much later. But anyway, there was this other vision, but it was right after the war that would have had a more what the free trade critics call a fair trade model, where labor standards would have been meaningfully protected, as well as there were these antitrust provisions. This was actually done a lot at the insistence of developing countries, particularly in Latin America, who were worried about American multinationals taking over their economies. But that is not what wound up happening. GATT became the model, which was basically like without any other provisions protecting labor and the environment.
Yeah, and NAFTA opened the door to big agribusiness from the United States, wrecking Mexico's small farm agriculture markets, and that led to migration, and then we get a backlash against migration. The whole point of this is, why would we want to relocate our factories if we have to pay the same wage or a higher wage over there? The whole point is for cheaper.
The point was cheap labor and fewer environmental regulations, fewer to none. And that was the goal.
In the context of your reporting, you're from Wisconsin, and you begin your great story in the New York Times Magazine at the Master Lock factory in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I did not realize this. Milwaukee was considered, the machine shop of the Midwest. So talk a little bit about the story of Master Lock. How does that epitomize what we're discussing here?
And by the way, Milwaukee, its moniker was Machine Shop of the World. It was an incredible industrial powerhouse, probably second only to Detroit in terms of its per capita. It had a more diversified manufacturing economy, not just automobiles. It was an incredible powerhouse. I think in the 50s, something close to 60% of the adult workforce worked in manufacturing. Most of these were well-paying union jobs. So it had the second highest median income in the United States. For working class people, there was a lot of widely shared prosperity. Master Lock was really interesting. It's a company that's very identified with Milwaukee. It was founded by a Russian immigrant in the 1920s, and he built this plant in the late 1930s. He was very involved in the company on a first-name basis with employees, quite generous to his employees. For example, when he built some opulent bathrooms for executives, he built the same opulent bathrooms for his employees.
But that was an age when the CEO did not make, 10,000 times more than the average worker. But go ahead. Yeah.
Exactly. He had a tiny little workshop in the office every day. It was decorated only by giant drawing of like 20,000 different Master Lock combinations. I'm forgetting the exact details. But he was a very monastic person that was really devoted to the company, and a very, by most accounts, all accounts really that I've read, kind and generous to them. He was friends with Harry Houdini, who helped promote, Master Lock in the 1920s with his famous images of him tied up in locks and so on. Harry Soroff is the guy's name. He had been an advance man for Barnum and Bailey's circus. Really interesting character. Anyway, he died in the late 1950s. The family sold to a multinational, I think in 1970. Deindustrialization began happening across the Midwest much earlier than NAFTA. For example, in the period between 1979 and 1983, a quarter of Milwaukee's manufacturing jobs went out. That was a period when Paul Volcker raised the interest rates to astronomical highs to tame inflation. It had a devastating effect on the Midwestern factories and plants and so on. A lot of them went out. It also spurred two back-to-back recessions, almost back-to-back, in the early 80s. There was at one point, there was a job opening at a company called, I think it was Alice Chalmers, which made agricultural machinery in Milwaukee. It was like a scene out of the Great Depression. You had 15,000 people gathered for 150 job openings in the early 80s. They slept overnight with like campfires and so on. It was a scene from like the 30s. And it was the beginning of a long process where these kinds of well-paying manufacturers' jobs began to go out. NAFTA accelerated and really incentivized this process, both implications for the economy, but also for political implications and balance of power implications between labor and capital.
Yeah, I appreciate you putting NAFTA in that larger historical context of deindustrialization, which has many causes, not just free trade deal. Often a free trade deal, as you say, accelerates a process that's already underway. Let's ride this wave and make this better. Well, that's the plan anyway.
Right. And the Maquiladora system, that's the factory system in Mexico, was already beginning before that. There was some special free trade zone along the border. But this was like putting, as one source of mine said, it put the government seal of approval on capital flight, basically, and moving these plants there where they could pay, for example, at Master Lock, when they built their plant in Nogales, Mexico in the late 90s, and a worker there was making roughly $1 an hour at
what was the
Master
salary
Lock.
again? What was the wage?
Mexico is about $1 an hour. In Milwaukee, it was $12 an hour plus wages and benefits. Plus, they had independent trade unions in Milwaukee. The unions in Mexico were government controlled, and they were basically there to increase as a tool for management to increase production or whatever. They were not what anybody would define as an independent trade union.
Yeah. This larger context is important. This is a global situation we're talking about here. And it's important to stress that because when politicians say, I'm just going to do this or I'm just going to do that, like they have a magic wand, there are global forces at work here in Mexico. So you mentioned the maquiladora factory system. What is that and why is that an important antecedent to NAFTA?
It's these low-wage factories built largely along the Rio Grande, where goods can be exported very quickly and cheaply to the United States just by truck or whatever, and workers migrate there. As you said earlier in the piece, I'm glad you mentioned this, NAFTA had incredible implications for agriculture, too. An incredible disassembling effect on both the United States and Mexico. And you had something like 2 million subsistence corn farmers that were wiped out by the flood of cheap corn from U.S. multinationals into Mexico. A lot of those people went to work in maquiladoras, or they migrated to the United States.
2 million.
2 million. Some of them were internal migrants, something between 1 and 2 million. No one knows exactly for sure.
So U.S. companies would go right over the border into Mexico, set up factories. Mexicans would then work in these factories, and the products would be essentially exported, a mile the other way back over the border into the United States. That's what you're saying.
Right. And then distributed across the country. But back to Master Lock, if you want, and
Sure.
I'm sorry I got distracted.
No. I just want to add one other thing before we go
please.
back to Master Lock. I'll share a passage from Sean Willentz's The Age of Reagan. You were referring to scenes that look like something out of the Great Depression in 1970s, 1980s Midwestern manufacturing or former manufacturing hubs. Willentz is writing about the mid-70s. The nation's auto industry was ailing badly, outperformed by foreign manufacturers, especially in Japan, which produced attractive and affordable vehicles that were far more fuel efficient than their American competitors, so they had a technological edge. Steel production and other heavy industries, writes Willentz, were also declining precipitously, underpriced by foreign firms and hit hard by union unrest. Traditional urban economic powerhouses such as Detroit and Cleveland were hemorrhaging jobs. The situation helped raise the national unemployment rate to 7.5% in 1975. But Master Lock was doing well during this period, right? Or
relatively
pretty well. Yeah.
There was a big strike at Master Lock in 1979 or 80. Milwaukee was an interesting town. It's a very strong labor town. It had socialist mayors, actually socialist mayors for 40 years of a 60-year period between 1910 and 1960. It was called sewer socialism. It was kind of a European reformist social democratic movement. It was a very strong labor town. And until then, there was a big meatpacking strike in 1975. They brought in replacement workers, scabs. And that was a first in Milwaukee. There was sort of a social compact that wouldn't happen between the 30s or early 40s and that period. And there was a wave of strikes in Milwaukee. There was something called the Lordstown Syndrome. There was a lot of blue collar unrest. People were coming back from Vietnam and so on. But at the same time, the American industrial economy was shrinking. Again, we haven't had an industrial policy like Germany, arguably until the Biden administration. And at least during this period, Sean Wilentz gave a glimpse of it. But even prior to NAFTA, you had a kind of internal NAFTA in that a lot of companies would threaten to move to right-to-work states in the South, where there were no unions because of so-called right-to-work laws. Unions are required to represent everybody at a workplace, but right-to-work laws allow people not to pay dues. It erodes a union's bargaining power and financial power. So they were very attractive. And states like South Carolina have something like a 1% unionization rate, or maybe 2% now. So they would either threaten to move or move internally. So it was a kind of an internal Mexico in a way where they get cheaper wages, no unions. That was already happening. And it points to another effect of NAFTA and all of this sort of capital flight. Sometimes the move never even happens, but there's the threat of the move, which can extract concessions, meaningful concessions. A woman in my piece, she's at Cornell, and she did a study shortly after NAFTA in which something like 50% after NAFTA, something like 50% of union contract negotiations, there was a threat to move. So it was a powerful cudgel for these companies.
Yeah, you quote someone in your piece who basically says to a worker, get moving, buddy. Like you've even threatened, get back to the assembly.
Or we'll move all the jobs, right.
Yeah.
And what happened, back to Masterlock for a second.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, they had 1,300 good-paying union middle-class jobs. 1,000 of those jobs were eliminated.
Right. That was in the first wave. In the late 90s, 1,000 were gone. Everybody thought the plant was just going. They held on to a rump faction.
And those jobs went to Mexico, correct?
Moved to, almost most of them to move to Mexico. They were already outsourcing to China some as well, even before the agreement with China. That had disastrous quality control effects. For example, something like 750,000 gun locks were recalled from China because they could be easily separated. But mostly it was to Mexico, the assembling jobs. But some people hung on. There was about 200 jobs that stayed in Milwaukee. And it sort of slowly built back up to something like 300 union jobs. And then there was a few management. So maybe the total workforce was 400 at a plant that, as you say, had 1,300 union positions before. And it became a kind of central nexus for the 2012 presidential election. Barack Obama trumpeted this reshoring, which was very modest. They brought back a few parts from China. It crept up to something like 325 union positions around 2012. And then he trumpeted this reshoring in his State of the Union address. And then he went to Masterlock and spoke about the importance of manufacturing.
So the result has been a pretty painful process for a lot of families and for a lot of communities, especially here in the Midwest. Too many factories where people thought they'd retire suddenly left town. Too many jobs that provided a decent living got shipped overseas. And now the hard truth is, a lot of those jobs are not going to come back. In a global economy, some companies are always going to find it more profitable to pick up and do business in some other part of the world. That's just a fact. But that doesn't mean we have to just sit by and settle for a lesser future. That doesn't mean there's nothing we can do to create new jobs and restore middle-class security here in America. There is always something we can do.
I think it shows two things. One, there wasn't a lot of success at reshoring. It was very modest. But it also shows the political salience of this issue, which has been going on. That's the funny thing. Like when you think about deindustrialization, it has been the central issue in a way since the 1980 presidential election. I'll give you an example. Ronald Reagan went to Youngstown. In a sense, the Rust Belt started in 1977, you could argue, when Youngstown Sheet and Tube announced suddenly, this was a steel company. Youngstown had something like 50,000 well-paying steel jobs, that it was closing, that 5,000 people were being laid off suddenly. It was called Black Monday. A lot of people remember where they were, sort of like when John F. Kennedy was shot. And Ronald Reagan came to Youngstown, said those jobs would have never left if I was here, if I had been president. And they actually held the Republican convention in Detroit, which I thought was very significant, given that it's the center of kind of U.S. manufacturing. And in fact, he used the phrase for the first time, "Make America Great Again." It was Trump that later patented it, but it was Reagan's phrase initially.
That's his 80 campaign slogan. I've played those ads on my show.
Yeah.
For those who've abandoned hope, we'll restore hope and we'll welcome them into a great national crusade to make America great again.
And it's been a central issue. Anyway, maybe it's too digressive, but...
No, the social fabric. Yeah. Nelson Lichtenstein, I have his book here, A Fabulous Failure. I think he's correct about NAFTA being more politically toxic than it was economically harmful, relative to, say, the number of jobs that went to China. Many more jobs went to China than to Mexico. But Mexico is right on our border. And
right. And if I could just amend that, I think politically, you would have never had the China deal if they had defeated NAFTA. The NAFTA was the breaking of the spine. You
A
had to
model
do
for
that.
future trade deals.
Right. It was the first trade deal with a low-wage country like that. And it set the template and the pattern. It was much more significant than just the number of jobs. It broke the political opposition to it. Because you remember, it was really a big fight in the Congress. Some polls had showed as many as 2/3 of the American public was against it.
I'd like for you to address the social fabric issue here when a factory closes and it's not replaced by anything. So Robert Reich, according to Lichtenstein in his book, he did campaign publicly very hard for NAFTA, but he didn't really want to do it. He was being a loyal soldier for Clinton. 3 years later, in his memoir, Locked in the Cabinet, which was the title of that memoir, he admitted he was skeptical about it all the time. He said there was scant money for retraining. So it was all about the benefits of NAFTA for American workers, which now seems crazy that anyone said that. Matter of fact, in Clinton's kickoff press conference to get NAFTA ratified, he used the figure of 1 million jobs, which was just scribbled in by a staffer because that was left blank in the original speech draft that Clinton went up there to speak with.
I believe that NAFTA will create 1 million jobs in the first 5 years of its impact.
But nothing to replace it. Scant money for retraining. Can you address that all through this story and how that tears at the social fabric of these communities?
You know, and I think a lot of that social fabric is through, the unions and the labor movement. I mean, for example, Master Lock. Twice a year, they have a neighborhood cleanup. This is a very impoverished neighborhood in Milwaukee. It used to have maybe as many as 30,000 jobs in a 4x20 block area called the 30th Street Corridor. Now, Master Lock is the last thing standing. It's a heavily African-American neighborhood, probably 95%, one of the highest, rates of violent crime. It's gone down a lot because of deindustrialization. Master Lock was still there, and the union did, for example, biannual cleanups in the neighborhood. They had a Christmas thing where the kids from the local school, which about 95% of the kids receive free lunch, very impoverished, would scratch out their Christmas list, and union members and the company would buy them Christmas gifts. They would come to the plant, and a worker dressed as Santa would give them things. There was a Halloween trick or treat that the union did. These are all things outside of just their job and showing up and punching the clock. Within the union movement, I think with the loss of these jobs and that, there were other aspects to it, like the retirees' picnics, and there was a social cohesion. Obviously, you have religious institutions, but the union movement was another place where that existed in American life. I did a piece about West Virginia. All of southern West Virginia is scattered with abandoned union halls from the United Mine Workers Association. And those places were meeting halls. People would have events, high school graduations, christenings, so on and so forth there.
On election night, when West Virginia was called for Donald Trump, I immediately went to Google and looked up the electoral history of West Virginia, and I saw all the years it was a reliable Democratic state.
Oh, sure.
Not
it voted
anymore.
for Bill Clinton by like 13 points in 1996. It was one of the most bedrock Democratic states. But you can see the effect of deindustrialization, which is also like twinned with deunionization, largely because manufacturing tends to be more heavily unionized. So I think, the loss of those jobs is tremendously, and you have a very atomized population then. And I think that is one of the preconditions for the rise of right-wing populism and this stoking of sort of a divide and conquer politics. But Trump was very clever in terms of seizing on this economic malaise that's highly concentrated. NAFTA had benefits for some Americans.
What were those? Cheap imports? What were they?
Cheap imports, Wall Street investors. I mean, it was great for corporate profits. There's a study by Josh Bivens at the Economic Policy Institute. For the 60% of the population that doesn't have a college degree, trade with low-wage countries costs them, on average, something like $2,000 a year, even accounting for lower consumer goods. In other words, controlling for that. So for most Americans, globalization is a net loss. It was presented as a win-win, but it is a win for the professional class and higher. And there's where you get like another kind of political fallout from this, and where Trump seized upon stoking this animosity. And a lot of this anger, a lot of the wealth went to people on the coast, and a lot of the misery went, particularly the industrial Midwest, which is where U.S. manufacturing was always heavily concentrated.
His instincts were right in 2016. Hillary Clinton's were not. About NAFTA, I remember his visit or his use of the Carrier air conditioning story during the 2016 campaign, how Carrier Air Conditioning, which was owned by, or which was a subsidiary of a large multinational firm, was threatening to move the plant from Indiana to Mexico, threatening all those generational middle-class jobs and have that social cohesion. Nothing really replaced that. Barack Obama did mention this once, how we didn't do enough on the other side to retrain and establish new industries.
Right. The retraining thing was always just...
in what industry? I mean, people might have to move somewhere, maybe. Where are they going to move? Silicon Valley? I mean, I've often wondered what they mean by that, but go ahead.
Right. I agree. And it's like, really, what are they? What kind of jobs would replace that? If you're not college educated, then you're talking about the transformation to the service sector, where the wages are like half, if. Just to comment on the Carrier story, that's also another facet of it. With Trump, it was false promises. I mean, nothing ever happened. He gave millions in state subsidies to keep some of the jobs there. He threatened the union leader of the Carrier plant, who was getting death threats because Chuck Jones called him out on these false numbers around the jobs that were saved. But it was a giant useful political tool. But what Trump actually did, and we can talk about this, for example, in NAFTA 2.0, which is called the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, he renegotiated NAFTA 2018. It was signed in 2020, but it did very little. And the only real meaningful concessions on the labor side were at the insistence of organized labor who pushed congressional Democrats to demand them. So, for example, it became easier for Mexican workers to unionize, meaning it would disincentivize the movement of capital. But the punishments were not that great. The Biden administration has done pretty well at pushing it, but it's not a significant impediment. Jobs are still moving there. And in fact, during the Trump administration and during the Biden administration, there's still an outflow of capital. One of the things that people don't understand is like these effects are still ongoing. Master Lock finally closed for good just this year, and more than that, the power dynamic hasn't altered at all. Corporate power is much greater.
And multinational corporations are more powerful than policymakers. I mean, they influence the policymakers.
NAFTA itself was drafted essentially, it was heavily influenced by hundreds of corporate lobbyists. Yeah. They essentially created the agreement they wanted.
And Bill Gates and a number of others put a lot of pressure on Clinton on the China WTO thing. So, one of the promises the pro-NAFTA people were making 30 years ago was that it would lead to job creation in the U.S., not just in Mexico. Did that ever happen?
Not in manufacturing, not working class jobs. They were trying to make the case that it would lead to this export boom, and people called them out at the time. There was a lot of criticism. The other factor in all of this is that the media was very supportive, both tacitly and forthrightly, for the agreement. And it was slanted in the front page coverage and also the editorial pages. One colleague of mine, a great labor reporter, Roger Bybee, had tallied something like 1,300 editorial pages in the United States were for NAFTA, and only a handful were opposed. So that was what they used to overwhelm popular opposition to it.
Well, maybe you can address this context then. This was happening at a time when some very powerful assumptions were guiding policymakers all over the world. And we're talking about some impersonal forces here. Globalization. There was also an idea, the end of history, between the two competing systems, market economics and democracy on one side, the command economy, political communism on the other. Well, that side lost, and therefore this is the right way of doing things. Basically, the argument was settled. So there were some very strong assumptions undergirding this optimism about the benefits of free trade deals.
Right. There was the promotion of that, and that was the peak period of neoliberal propagation, the triumph, the end of communism, and so on. And there was a lot of hyperbolic, frankly, absurd rhetoric at that time, like the stuff you just described, the end of history. What does that even mean? And this is how the proponents of NAFTA and these types of agreements, anybody that stood in the way to it was the past. There was this sort of triumphalist inevitability to free trade. It was just a given. It was sort of like a law of nature or something, even though it wasn't. It was very manufactured by political choices. That's how it was sold, and the media abetted that selling.
In Clinton's speech on his kickoff press conference to get NAFTA ratified, he made that point. He said, history is moving in this direction.
I tell you, my fellow Americans, that if we learn anything from the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the governments in Eastern Europe, even a totally controlled society cannot resist the winds of change.
But it is hard to reverse a force as powerful as globalization. And I know it's the result of choices, too. As you said before, you could have a free trade deal or a fair trade deal. You can actually have labor and environmental standards baked into these agreements. We chose not to.
Right. I don't know if it's hard to. It's hard to in the context of corporate power and their opposition to it and their capture of a lot of the politics of our country and other Western countries and so on, and all countries, so you could do it. I mean, it was done before, and you could say not trade with countries that don't have independent trade unions, or for example, and that would incentivize the creation of independent trade unions. It's just that we don't do it. Those choices are always still political. I don't think that there's no alternative. I think that was Maggie Thatcher's phrase, there is no alternative. That was how it was presented in order to sell it, but there's no basis for that, really.
Well, it's a good political argument.
We had tariffs before, and the U.S. economy prospered.
I'm not a fan of tariffs, but I can understand why now they're coming back into favor among at least some people in Trump's circle. One more thing, Dan Kaufman, I'd like you to comment on, because we are talking about consensus ideas, impersonal forces, when really these are choices that we're making. There was another so-called Washington consensus during this period, talking about early 1990s, end of the Cold War, referencing Nelson Lichtenstein's book again. It was forged by the IMF, another international organization, and other U.S.-dominated financial institutions. And that policy consensus was designed to put debt-burdened third world countries on a path to export-led growth for drastic reductions on social spending, the privatization of much of the state sector, unhindered capital mobility, and increasing degrees of free trade, what some people call the neoliberal order, because Mexico had been an economy based on import substitution industrialization, or maybe small-scale industrialization. But Mexico got into a lot of debt, so it needed an export-driven economy to pay off its debt. And there's something else. I actually am going to get to a question here, Dan,
no problem,
that Lichtenstein mentions in this context I'd like for you to comment on. And that is a change in manufacturing itself that exploited this opportunity in Mexico. He calls it the rise of supply chains as the new organizational template for international business.
Cars are assembled in different pieces in different locations, often a transmission plant. These are all across the Midwest. So I think it did assist in that process. I'm sure. I think the auto industry was maybe most heavily exposed to NAFTA, but other things like master lock and so on. There's the subject of a great book by John MacArthur called The Selling of Free Trade is the swing line stapler factory, and that moved. I think supply chains freed up partial movement of capital. Maybe you could do it in stages. I haven't really thought about that topic that closely, to be honest.
Are we now entering a new era of antipathy toward free trade and old school 19th century or pre-World War II Smoot-Hawley tariff-like trade wars?
I think that antipathy era has already begun. Whether there's meaningful change, I don't know. I view Trump as not really deviating much from the neoliberal consensus, the neoliberal economics that had predominated. When you look at the changes in NAFTA 2.0, it was modest at best. There were tariffs, for example, on steel. There were so many exceptions to it. Only about 17% of steel imports were subject to these tariffs. For example, Australia was, and then China was dumping a lot of its steel in Mexico. So it wasn't done in a systematic way, in a way that you might want to do it in coordination with allies, for example, to block the cheap Chinese steel. It was done for political effect. So I don't know. There's two different questions. The antipathy part, as we've already entered, nobody is pushing anything like the TPP and hasn't since 2016. One of Trump's first executive actions was to pull out of it. But I don't know if anything meaningful substantively has happened. I do think the Biden administration pulled away somewhat. It was the first administration where there was no new free trade agreement negotiated.
Yeah. Well, fundamentally, Trump's populism is a phony populism. He has no real economic agenda for middle-class people.
It's still really Wall Street driven. I mean, even during 2016, his earlier administration, Steve Mnuchin and Gary Cohn, I mean, these were Wall Street guys. There was other people like Robert Lighthizer, who did negotiate, who was a trade representative, who was genuinely concerned about this, but most of his policy was the same old. His tax cuts in 2017, they actually incentivized offshoring by lowering the tax rates on foreign profits. So it wasn't subtly different, but he was very good at selling a difference to working class people, and he understood the salience of jobs as an issue.
2 decades of politicians ran for office vowing to replace the NAFTA, and this was a catastrophe, the NAFTA catastrophe. Yet once elected, they never even tried. They never even gave it a shot. They sold out. But I'm not like those other politicians, I guess in many ways. I keep my promises, and I'm fighting for the American worker. And we're all fighting for the American worker. Everybody here is fighting for the American worker.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, another fixation of the age of Trump has been comparisons to Nazi Germany, the rise of Hitler, and the destruction of German democracy in the Weimar Republic. We're going to deconstruct those comparisons and try to properly understand the rise of Hitler, as well as the right lessons to learn from that dark chapter in history. That's next as we report History as It Happens. New episodes every Tuesday and Friday. Sign up for my newsletter free on Substack. Search for History as It Happens.